As I said earlier, good afternoon, everyone, for the fourth lecture of the second session, which will deal with the issue of disentangling complex realities, centering on the anti-gender politics in a comparative perspective, offering you first and foremost a more regional comparative framework, and then with some specific insights from Romania and respectively Ukraine. My name is Cristian Norocel. I work at the University of Lund in Sweden. As you may see on the slide, my expertise is exactly on intersectional perspectives on radical right populism, as well as far-right mobilization across Europe from a comparative perspective. So I have a specialty on the cases of Sweden and Finland, as well as Hungary and Romania. I work as a senior lecturer in the Department of Gender Studies here at Lund, and I am an associate professor, so a docent, as they say in here, in gender studies, as well as having the title of docent or docenti in political science from the University of Helsinki in Finland. At the basis, I have a PhD in political science. To anchor a bit my talk today, so I would like to mention the fact that I have been doing research on anti-gender mobilization for some time, and I've been actively part of wider research projects, both more regional, like the first example of an ethnographic exploration of anti-genderism, as well as more wider regional comparative frameworks, as the one that you have here in original in its French, which reads Campagne anti-genre en Europe, un jeu de savoir, un jeu de pouvoir. The translation into English is not really very important, and as you could notice, those of you who speak French, my French is rather awful, so I need to admit to that. What is important is to keep in mind that when we think in terms of development goals, this lecture aims to deal with those aspects in terms of gender equality, reduced inequality, as well as peace, justice, and strong institutions. With this being said, let us delve directly into the topic. So, we need to be able, when we are talking about anti-gender campaigns, to disentangle complex realities. And in here, we need to be able to contextualize not only at the regional level in the Eastern European context, but also we need to understand a bit what are the wider strokes, what has happened mainly at more global level, and also how those global developments had repercussions and sent its waves, if you wish, towards the Eastern European context. So in here we see that anti-gender campaigns actually are a new wave of activism and policy initiatives against the rights of women, but also against the rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex community, also known as LGBTQI. That have started somewhere in the mid-2000s, but actually have explored and exploded in the Eastern European context since 2010s. What is actually what we are talking about when we're talking about anti-gender campaigns? Well, basically, it is a renewal of the conservative activism across the world, in which we see a modernization and a targeting of frames and strategies, a generational shift, so much younger people that are recruited into these things, new ways of thinking, new ways of articulating and doing this sort of campaigns, as well as a clearer transnational aspect of this activism and policymaking. And I will delve into this in a second, what it means. And what do these campaigns have in common is this idea that identifies gender, most of the times labeled disparagingly, I would argue, as gender ideology or gender theory or genderism, as the ideological matrix of these various reforms that they oppose. So I want to make a very clear distinction between how we as scholars understand gender and operationalize gender, and the way this anti-gender campaign mobilization understands it and uses it. However, given the fact that in the European context, there was a lack of concepts to be able to describe this sort of mobilization and the expansion of these movements, most of the times in the initial phases, there was a way of borrowing, particularly from the US context, such terminology as backlash, culture wars, or counter movement. And these were deployed for analyzing various contexts across Europe, and also particularly in the East European context that is of interest for us, with various degrees of success. This notwithstanding, researchers from or of Eastern Europe have lifted quite quickly the importance of paying attention to the specificities of the region, in terms of the interactions between neoliberalism, authoritarianism, and neoconservatism in the Eastern European context. And then here, why am I emphasizing this regional aspect? Well, because the region in general has witnessed to a profound destructuring of the societies that these polities host, as well as an open up in this context of destructuring for autocratic leaders and anti-gender politics. So if you wish, these politicians react to the post-communist free market mantra and neoliberal reforms. And here we see how radical right populist leaders appear as a form of conservatives' retaliation against neoliberalism in the region. However, and here it's important to underline, so I was mentioning in the beginning of my presentation that I'm both a scholar specializing in radical right populism as well as anti-gender mobilization. And in here, I need to emphasize the fact that I agree with my colleagues that argue that these are not the two sides of the same coin, but actually they are rather two distinct phenomena that in some contexts might be interacting and intersecting and strengthening one another through that interaction, or they might be having rather different agendas in other contexts. And from this point of view, I agree with Elżbieta Korolczuk and Agnieszka Graf in their theorizing of this coming together of these two forces as an opportunistic synergy, the situation in which we have the mutually beneficial interaction between two types of actors. On the one hand, we have the radical right populist actors, together with conservative parties that make use of anti-gender rhetorics to increase their moral legitimacies in the eyes of the traditional voters. But the other set of actors are also the ultra-conservative organizations, as well as organized religious organizations that attempt to introduce legal changes, and gain access to funding and participate in the policy-making process. From that point of view, together with other colleagues across Europe, I have suggested the concept of retrogressive mobilization. And this mobilization is slightly more nuanced than that of opportunistic synergy. It can be used in combination with this term. But what it tries to do is making sense of the complex assemblage of, on the one hand, political parties. And in here, indeed, we have the mainstream conservative right parties, together with radical right populist parties. We also have religious institutions. And in here, we would need to be aware of the fact that we have both religious institutions with a national jurisdiction. So think of the various national Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe, like Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or the Georgian Church, or the Romanian Orthodox Church, as well as those with international jurisdiction. And here we think of Catholic Church that has this kind of universal, if you wish, jurisdiction, as well as ultra-conservative civil society organizations. So those who are actively militating against women's reproductive rights or against equal marriage rights of the LGBTQI community, and so on and so forth. And in this retrogressive mobilization, we also see far-right groupings that are preoccupied with safeguarding the majority population's ethnic, but also racial purity within the polity in question. So armed with this conceptual standpoints, we delve into and seeing what are the commonalities that we see across the various European polities in Eastern Europe in terms of how does the anti-gender mobilization take shape and looks like in the region. And in here, we need to keep in mind, first and foremost, and one important aspect to remember is exactly this issue of the legacy of atheism as a quasi-doctrine during the communist regimes. This quality of atheism as a quasi-doctrine had left quite a strong legacy in certain in East European contexts. So, for instance, when we talk about such countries as particularly Czechia, we see that large sections of the population embrace more secular values compared to the other polities around it. At the same time, we see that the high levels of trust that have been enjoyed by the religious institutions, particularly after the collapse of communism, have enabled them to take more and a more active place in the national politics, in the other polities. And in here, I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, for instance, in the Polish context or in Croatia, as well as, for instance, the Orthodox churches in Romania or Ukraine or Georgia that have traded their support basically for various parties for subsequent policy concessions, yes, against particularly the rights of women and the LGBTQI communities. At the same time, this is very interesting and an important aspect to keep in mind, that the growth and prominence of this religious institution had happened in a kind of a consecutive process in which we see the consolidation of the national identities in these polities across the region that was accompanied by a process of retraditionalization and discovering and pushing for a spiritual rebirth. And here it's very important to keep in mind that exactly these religious institutions have played an active role in supporting that traditional rebirth, promoting a conservative political agenda to the top of the priorities for the policies in question. And then here we see how these religious institutions have been always interested in fusing a specific religious affiliation with that of the ethnic majority in the polity in question. So in here we have that discussion about the Polak Catholic, for instance, or in the Romanian context, that argument that Romanians were born into Orthodox Christianity from time immemorial. So connecting nationhood and a specific religious denomination and melting them into one. Then, of course, this did not happen into a vacuum. So we need to keep in mind also the fact that the post-communist welfare regimes in Eastern Europe, and in here we need to think about how, with the collapse of communism and the promise of EU accession, we see how this whole idea about the transition of these polities, of reshaping their political system and economic system, had been packaged as an imperative to move past their communist legacy, to disregard their previous welfare principles, in terms of striving for that kind of more equal societies that were the guiding words of communism, at least formally, into an adoption of the neoliberal shock therapy as being the best vehicle to catch up with their Western counterparts and in a way confirm their return to Europe and their belonging to the European family. And in here we notice that, for instance, that this whole discussion about our return to Europe in the Eastern European context had happened at various times in the various polities. Yeah. So for instance, if nowadays we see that most of the Central and Eastern European countries are part of the EU, they've been already welcomed. We see a similar sort of discussion in terms of, when we think of countries like Moldova or Ukraine or even Georgia. Yeah. And how this is connected to this idea that, neoliberal shock therapy is the one to be implemented as a first step towards that. The consequences of that were that wave after wave of Eastern European citizens would be migrating across EU, since this neoliberal dogma had actually led to profound economic crises and economic devastation that was accompanied by social upheaval that translated into a general process of de-democratization, particularly in the Central European context. And what we witness to in that context is a welfare retrenchment, so a narrowing down of and the prominence of the welfare chauvinist discourse that is making an ethno-nationalist distinction between who is the in-group and worthy of welfare services and who is part of the out-group and they are not deserving. And then here I would like to lift up the paradoxical situation of the Roma community across the various polities in Eastern Europe, because on the one hand, they have lived in these countries and this region for centuries and centuries, but at the same time, they are constantly and programmatically denied being part of these polities, And when they are done that, even in those cases, they are never accepted as being, if you wish, a deserving part of the population that should be benefiting from welfare services as the same way as any other citizen, yes? And in here, it becomes a very important inflection point when we think of the issue of the rights of women and LGBTQI communities. Because in a sense, these, if you wish, renewed awareness to particularly to women's rights, it looked as if it was imposed from Brussels as part of the acquis communautaire. And it was packaged as a way of an outsider influence that was posing a threat to state sovereignty, that was posing a threat to national values, as well as national identity. And then here we see that actually this process of EU accession and the accompanying process of Europeanization are very complicated processes. Yes, so and here I would like even to correct my own slide and say that they are processes in plural. On the one hand, we see how the unequal integration of Eastern European polities into the EU had led to a growing resentment against the West, against Europe, that in these quarters of anti-gender mobilizing or actors, the EU is perceived as the cradle itself of gender ideology, as the main purveyor of gender and sexuality policies. So we see how gender has become a symbol of a new form of colonization. This time is exercised by the West, It's directed against Eastern Europe, and it is tied to Europeanization, to globalizing neoliberal order forces. And in here we see, particularly in the Polish context, a very clear example of that, in which the rallying cry was to mobilize against Ebola from Brussels. That was created in ultra-conservative quarters, but then it was readily embraced by radical right populist parties as a way to weaken the Polish population's support for EU institutions. And Ebola from Brussels, of course, it brings a very, if you wish, a very poignant imaginary. So on the one hand, talking about Brussels as some sort of a distant location of the EU institutions. So Brussels is used as a shorthand for the very complicated architecture of European institutions that may or may not be necessarily located, all of them, in Brussels. At the same time, also juxtaposing it to the references to a very dangerous and lethal virus, Ebola, that usually is very damaging to humans. So comparing this gender to being or qualifying it as an Ebola from Brussels wanted to show to their supporters and to the wider public that gender is spreading very quickly. So the idea about gender is spreading very quickly, and that also can be a very dangerous thing and can have very dangerous effects for the polity in question. Please keep in mind, this is the way of articulating this discussion from the anti-gender mobilization quarters. So this is how these actors have tried to make sense of this development. And then here we see that these anti-gender campaigns had a certain level of success. So we talk about, if you wish, a certain failure of the Europeanization process, since this was perceived as mainly an elitistic and a technocratic process, rather than being deeply anchored with the citizens in these polities and kind of having a more natural and bottom-up way of engaging the society in general. This notwithstanding, we need to also be able to talk about a very important factor. So if in the previous slide I was talking to you about what was seen as a colonization from the West, we need to be able to talk about Russian imperialism and its various iterations, and its impact that it had on the Eastern European polities. And here we need to go back a bit and think about the USSR and how the USSR had, if you wish, a very interesting impact both within the polity itself, so how the wider Russian-dominated USSR framework kind of imposed its rule onto the various republics that were constituting the Union, as well as also on the so-called Eastern European satellites, so those who had been part of the Warsaw Pact in the post-1945 context. And why it is important to look at the USSR? Well, because it casts a very, very long shadow. I mean, that sort of regime that has lasted over several generations, it had also provided the longest opportunity to see how one could put into practice some very specific ideas about social welfare and also about gender equality, as well as I was discussing a bit earlier in the previous slide, to enforce atheism as a state doctrine. And of course, these ideas have been later on spread over more or less forcefully also onto the other satellites of in Eastern Europe. What happened then in the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the USSR, we see how the landscape, the political landscape and the social landscape had changed dramatically, how traditional values become an almost official ideology, particularly in the Russian Federation, but also being used for political ends as well in the other polities across the region. And here, however, it's very important to keep in mind how the Russian Orthodox Church, by its sheer size, I mean, it is a very large religious institution, how it had returned back to that principle, the Byzantine principle of symphonia, so the coordination between the state and church powers. And if we are to make a parallel to the ongoing occupation war that is happening at the moment in Ukraine, we see how the present patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church had always tried to justify the invasion in religious terms, so trying to enforce Putin's political agenda by saying, well, this is actually a religiously sanctioned war. We will come back to that in a quick second. What happened was, in the Russian context, is that we see how this imperative of defending the Russian nation and its sovereignty from whatever is considered to be Western influence overlap this idea of protecting the children, and the children become not necessarily the physical children that one might think of taking care of and so on, but they become in a way a symbol, an embodiment of the nation's future. So you have a projection of the figure of the child rather than just referring on to the physical aspect of the children, so the children themselves. And then here we see how this idea of defending Russian nation, fighting against Western influence and protecting the mythical, the symbolic child, takes on an expansionist and transnational form. And then here we see already the coalescence of an opposition between, on the one hand, so-called traditional values that in the Russian context, these powers were trying to embody, as well as the European values, that they seem to be the kind of the other pole of this dynamic, of this dialogical dynamic. And here we see how this is made into a geopolitical marker that is embodying the cultural limits between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So whenever, for instance, the Russian Federation would be having an intention of disciplining the various polities in the famous near abroad, so that concept of near abroad, so how Russia has an alleged right to exercise control over the polities around it, so in the near abroad. This idea that, well, certain countries are becoming too European, or they risk becoming too European was always used as a counterforce. Yeah, so in a way to justify their own traditional values, but also opening up more or less discreetly, but not so discreetly, I would argue, for direct pressure from the Russian Federation, as well as a way to justify potentially military interventions in the various polities in the region. And here we go back to the issue of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Yeah, so we see how the Russian Federation's intervention was justified also with the imperative to liberate the country, apparently, from the European Union's coercive homosexualization. Yeah, while the Ukrainian authorities are willing to consider forms of same-sex marriage to prove that they are belonging to Europe. So we see also this kind of very complicated field that the Ukrainian polity needs and the Ukrainian society is trying to navigate at the moment. On the one hand, the ongoing war and trying to liberate parts of the country. At the same time, also this idea about, potentially joining the EU, and the idea of, joining the other European countries, and this adopting and embracing a more emancipatory ideals about the society that they are living in. And if we are to look, and I see that the time has really flown away, so I was really afraid that this would happen. I would like now in the final parts of this lecture to present you with a very quick comparison between Romania and Ukraine. I do hope that you have had the possibility of reading the articles that I have presented for today, that we have for this lecture. So I will focus only on a very topical comparison. Of course, the caveat here is that I know that my colleague Marina Shepsova has written a comparative in her own article, and she was also focusing on the issue of Ukraine and Georgia. Unfortunately, as you can see, for the lack of time, I would just look at the Ukrainian case from Marina's article, and I will present you some insights from the Romanian case that I have co-written with my Romanian colleague. The ambition being, of course, to provide you with a comparative context for the Ukrainian case. Yeah, this doesn't mean that the Georgian case does not have value. It's just that we do not have the space for delving into it more in detail at the moment. With this being said, in that comparative framework, I just want to expose you, so to present you very interesting ways how both politicians, but also churches, have tried to justify their position in the Romanian or respectively the Ukrainian society, and how this idea that their fight against gender ideology is presented not only as a self-interest act of rather powerful religious institutions or rather influential politicians, but more as a, if you wish, a confrontation that engages the nations in their entirety. Yes, so the societies, the Romanian, respectively Ukrainian societies in their entirety, the Romanian nation and the Ukrainian nation in their entirety, and the issue that is played by religion in this context for protecting the natural order, if you wish, as it was framed in the Romanian case, or protecting against gender ideology in the Ukrainian case. And then here I just present you with a few excerpts from these two articles that I have put side by side to allow you to see the similarity in the way of presenting this situation, in the way how religious institutions, conservative politicians position themselves on one side of the conflict, if you wish, and how they try to describe their opponents as an ideology, as something that is not natural, that is actually just part of a propaganda that wants to, at the end of the day, has as its aim to lead to the dissolution of these societies. Yeah. So in here we see how, for instance, in the Romanian case, the civil society's mobilization against the anti-gender campaigns that wanted to change the constitution to narrowly define the marriage only possible only between a man and a woman. And they were saying that these were just attacks against the church, against the parliamentarians, but even more important, they were an attack at the very fiber of the Romanian nation, that they were pushing for political correctness, but in so doing, they were actually leading to the destruction of Christian values and an attack at the very national identity of the Romanian society. And then here we see how this whole idea about gender is baked into an alleged ideology. Yeah, so in here we see how gender, in their understanding as gender ideology, is connected or made an equivalent to Nazism as well as communism. Yeah, so regardless how on an ideological scale it would not really make sense to have an ideology from the far right connected with an ideology from the far left, so they put everything in there and they say, gender is basically just as bad as these other two. Why? Well, because the idea that it's actually an ideology against nature and against the very national fiber and the religious beliefs of the nation in question. If very quickly we look at what is going on in the Ukrainian context, we see how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church tries to have a similar way of reasoning, yeah, and is also mobilizing against gender ideology under the claim that everything is done, everything is pursued in the name of defending freedom of religion. So in here we see how freedom in itself is used as a battle word for the conservatives. And then here we see that how a specific bill that the government was trying to push in that context was deemed to be able to cause the indignation of millions of believers because they would oppose the imposition of gender ideology upon the Ukrainian society. And believers will not tolerate attacks on the freedom of religion. And this will also lead to civil protests. So in a way, leading to the danger of seeing a split within the Ukrainian society itself. And then when it comes to the issue of sexual education, we see an even clearer way of how sexual education is presented as the opposite of what they deem to be the spiritual and pro-family curriculum. So this whole idea about educating young children about, well, their own sexuality, about, how issues of reproduction, issues of hygiene, issues of consent, and so on and so forth, is actually packaged as a propaganda for masturbation, a propaganda for sexual experiments, and also that could lead to various sexual deviations. And in here we see how they're not really on top of their terminology, because they, on the one hand, they talk about LGBT, but then they talk also about transgenderism. So one wonders, what is the final T in LGBT part of if it's not transgenderism? Or how do they think in there? And of course, the biggest fear that they always vehiculate in these contexts is that the change of gender. So that idea that we will see also in the Slovenian context of people allegedly being able to change their gender several times a day. It's never explained how that would be possible, but there's this fear that we would lead that a gender sensitive agenda would be leading to societies in which citizens will not be having essentialized gender roles, but basically they will be just shifting from man, woman, in between, everything, nothing, and so on, ad infinitum. And this would actually lead to the very collapse of the society that they are part of. Yeah, so it's this danger that they always try to kind of scare people off. Yeah, so from that point of view, I would argue that it's this idea that we have this innocent people, yeah, so the Eastern Europeans, particularly in this context, that they themselves have already a predetermined idea what it means to be, for instance, Romanian, what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be Georgian. And then we see how this big machine, coordinated by Brussels or coordinated by Western Europe, just comes over and it kind of flattens them out with this idea of gender ideology and all these things, in terms of how the very nation is endangered and how that source of the danger is actually driven, if you wish, as in this picture, is sourced in Brussels, in the West. So to conclude, because I see that time is really not in our favor, where does Eastern European fit in the wider context of anti-gender mobilization, you may be wondering? What does it mean to study anti-gender politics in Eastern Europe? Well, I would argue that what it allows us to do is to become aware of how these transnational trends, how similar developments had happened across various polities in Western Europe, in the US nowadays, even in the African context, how these trends have been translated to the specificities of the local context. So to use the word that we had in the introduction of our special issue, how these trends have been vernacularized. So vernacular expressions of these trends. And then here also we have taken issue with the conceptual incongruence within the academic discussion. So pointing out to the things that it's not easy to come with ready-made concepts from the Western context, particularly from the US, and just apply them flatly and try to press down onto rather complicated and sometimes paradoxical realities in Eastern Europe. So the expectations, particularly of Western scholars that are not aware of the specificities of the Eastern European polities, might not be met with the same level of if you wish, academic quality, in terms of, the concepts might not be really fitting the context. So then it's good that we have a series of, if you wish, both researchers from the region, but also that I have a close and a long career of studying the region, understand how we need to understand this vernacular manifestations of the anti-gender trends. And why is it important then to study anti-gender politics in this context? Well, because as David Paternot had recently argued, that gender issues may be used as, if you wish, the canary in the coal mine. So the very first signs of anti-gender mobilization might draw our attention to much wider autocratic developments, to much wider far-right mobilization that might be leading to a whole cascading into illiberal endeavors later down the line. And then to conclude, well, why is it important now? Why do we have this lecture in, at the end of 2023? For very pragmatic reasons as well. Well, because 2024, it is an important year for Europe in general, for the European Union, because we will have the European parliamentary elections in early summer. And it might be the inflection point when we might be witnessing to mainstreaming of the far right. So we already see how within these discussions at European level, conservative parties and conservative right parties are starting flirting more or less openly with far right forces. And that might be having a consequence for the European Union in general, but also for Eastern European polities, particularly for those countries that would like to join the European Union. In the Romanian case, it's even more important because, Romania would be basically witnessing a series of elections in 2024, because they will be organizing elections for the local level. They will be organizing parliamentary elections for the national parliament in Romania, as well as presidential elections, on top of the EU parliamentary elections that they organize, of course, together with the other EU member states. And then for Ukraine, I would argue and then here I would like to open the floor in a second for discussion, I would argue that actually 2024 is important, and the issue of anti-gender campaigns is important for the Ukrainian society in general, because hopefully what we will see with the conclusion of the ongoing war waged by the Russian Federation, perhaps a more substantive form for its EU membership hopes. Yeah, and then here I'm talking only about Ukraine, because that was the topic of our lecture today, but I'm not ignoring in any way the other countries that have the same EU membership ambitions, like Georgia or Moldova in Eastern Europe. With this being said, and I really hope that Google Translate did not play tricks on me, I would like to thank you for your patience. And in a second, I will be finishing my recording, and I will open the floor for discussions.